On January 3rd, 1889, in the city of Turin, the most dangerous mind of the 19th century finally broke. A respected professor ran into a busy street, threw his arms around a horse being whipped by its driver, and collapsed into tears. The silence that followed would last 11 years. This wasn't a random breakdown. Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who declared God is dead and predicted the horrors of the 20th century with eerie precision, the philosopher whose ideas would influence everyone from Sigmund Freud to existentialists to modern tech entrepreneurs, may have seen something in that suffering animal that shattered the final barrier between genius and insanity. He saw the cracks in our reality before anyone else, warning that when civilizations lose their foundation, they search desperately for new absolutes, often with catastrophic results. The ideological slaughters of the 20th century, the totalitarian regimes, the crisis of meaning we still face today, he predicted it all. Born in 1844 in the tiny village of Röcken, Friedrich's life began in the shadow of the cross. His father was a Lutheran pastor, his home a sanctuary of faith. But tragedy strikes quickly in the making of a skeptic. By the time Friedrich was 5, his father had died of a mysterious brain disease, followed months later by his infant brother. The house of men was empty. Surrounded now by women, his mother, grandmother, and sister, young Fritz retreated inward. He didn't play in the streets, he played in his mind. By age 10, while other boys learned to fight, Nietzsche was composing music and writing plays. He was brilliant, but he was fragile. Sent to the prestigious Pforta boarding school, he was subjected to a brutal monastic regime of study. Here he excelled, but the cost was physical. He was plagued by blinding migraines, days spent in darkened rooms with pain clawing behind his eyes, pain that would become the constant rhythm of his life. It was in this darkness that the rebel was born. By his late teens, the good Christian boy was dying. He began to see the values of his society not as divine laws, but as chains. In 1865, at the University of Bonn, he made the terrifying decision to break them. He told his devastated mother he would not be a priest. He was done with theology. He was hunting for a new truth. He found it in a bookstore in Leipzig. He stumbled upon the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher who argued that the world was driven by a blind, insatiable will. It was a dark, godless worldview, and Nietzsche fell in love with it. It was the first step toward his own philosophy, but he still needed a father. He found one in 1868 in the form of Richard Wagner. The famous composer was charismatic, revolutionary, and exactly what Nietzsche craved. When Wagner invited the young student into his inner circle, Nietzsche felt he had finally found his home. Riding this wave of confidence, Nietzsche achieved the impossible. At just 24, he was made a professor at the University of Basel. He had prestige, he had security, and he had Wagner just a train ride away. But Nietzsche was not built for comfort, he was built for truth, and truth destroys idols. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, was a love letter to Wagner, but the academic world hated it. His reputation tanked. Then the illusion of Wagner began to fade. Nietzsche realized the composer was an egoist, wrapped in the very Christian moralizing Nietzsche despised. The breakup was slow, painful, and inevitable. By 1878, with the publication of Human, All Too Human, Nietzsche severed the tie. He had killed his surrogate father. By 1879, his body followed his heart into collapse. Racked by agony and blinded by migraines, he resigned his professorship. He was 35, unemployed, alone and sick, but he was also free. He packed his bags to become a wanderer, drifting between the mountains and the sea, ready to write the books that would shake the foundations of history. In 1882, Nietzsche published a sentence that would become the most misunderstood declaration in modern philosophy. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. He wasn't celebrating. He was diagnosing a cultural catastrophe that would lead to the ideological slaughters of the 20th century, totalitarian regimes, and a crisis of meaning so profound that millions would willingly march into mechanized death rather than face the emptiness left behind. To understand what Nietzsche meant, you have to grasp that he wasn't talking about whether God literally exists. He was talking about God as the organizing principle of European life. For over 1,000 years, Christianity had provided answers to every fundamental question. Then came the Enlightenment. Science began explaining natural phenomena without miracles. Darwin proposed evolution. Gradually, educated Europeans stopped genuinely believing. The foundation had cracked. Nietzsche saw through the pretense. When he declared God dead, he meant that Christianity no longer functioned as the ultimate source of meaning. And here's the terrifying part. Nietzsche believed this would lead to catastrophe because most people couldn't handle the void. Nietzsche predicted that the 20th century would be the bloodiest in human history precisely because people would search desperately for new absolutes to replace God. Nationalism, communism, fascism. He called this nihilism. But Nietzsche didn't just diagnose the problem. He proposed a solution, the Übermensch. This wasn't a genetic superior. The Übermensch was Nietzsche's vision of a human being who could create their own values in the absence of God, who could look into the void and not flinch. For centuries, people outsourced meaning to religion. The Übermensch refuses this. They take full responsibility for creating their own meaning. This requires immense courage because there's no cosmic backup. You're alone in a universe that doesn't care whether you exist. Nietzsche introduces the Übermensch in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885. Zarathustra announces, "I teach you the Übermensch, man is something that shall be overcome." For Nietzsche, humanity isn't the end point of evolution. We're a bridge between animals and something higher. But the Übermensch isn't just about personal development. It's about a fundamental reorientation of values. Nietzsche argued that Christian morality, what he called slave morality, had dominated Western civilization too long. Slave morality emerged from the weak and elevated values like humility, meekness, self-denial. But Nietzsche believed they were fundamentally life-denying. In contrast, Nietzsche proposed master morality, the value system of the strong. Master morality celebrates strength, beauty, nobility, pride. It says yes to existence without needing consolation of another world. The distinction becomes clearer with ressentiment, a French word describing the smouldering resentment of the weak toward the strong. It's poisonous, festering hatred that creates elaborate moral systems to condemn whatever it envies. Nietzsche believed Christianity was built on ressentiment. The early Christians couldn't defeat Rome militarily, so they waged moral warfare instead. Connected to the Übermensch is the will to power. He didn't mean the will to dominate others. He meant the fundamental drive in all living things to grow, to express their strength. For Nietzsche, will to power is the basic fact of existence. Now we come to amor fati, love of fate. Amor fati means actively affirming your life exactly as it is, including all the suffering. It means reaching a state where you wouldn't change anything because everything made you who you are. Nietzsche connects amor fati to eternal recurrence. Imagine you'll live your exact same life over and over for eternity. Would this crush you, or could you affirm it? For Nietzsche, your answer reveals everything about your psychological health. Without God, life becomes finite, painful, ultimately meaningless. Most people can't handle this. The Übermensch needs none of this. They look at a godless universe and say yes anyway. They create meaning through their actions. They become their own authority. In 1888, Nietzsche wrote 8 words that would be quoted endlessly. "What does not kill me makes me stronger." But here's what almost no one realizes. He didn't mean this as inspirational advice. He meant it as a brutal statement about how greatness is forged through agony, how the most profound creative achievements emerged directly from psychological torment and existential despair so intense that most people would have chosen death instead. Nietzsche believed suffering wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary. Not suffering as an unfortunate side effect, but suffering as the primary engine of human excellence. By the time Nietzsche wrote his mature works, he was living in constant agony. The headaches were unbearable. He spent weeks unable to read or write. And yet, during this period, Nietzsche produced his greatest works. This wasn't coincidence. Nietzsche believed his suffering gave him insights that healthy people could never access. In his notebooks, Nietzsche wrote that only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. He's saying that ordinary life allows you to maintain pleasant fictions. But when you're in sustained agony, those fictions burn away. You see yourself clearly, perhaps for the first time. In The Birth of Tragedy, he'd already identified suffering as central to Greek greatness. The ancient Greeks understood that life is inherently tragic. But instead of denying this, the Greeks created tragedy as art that confronted suffering directly. Nietzsche distinguished between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Greek tragedy achieved its power by balancing these forces. Then came Socrates and Christianity. Both taught that suffering results from human failure and could be eliminated. Nietzsche believed this was catastrophic. By denying the value of earthly existence, European civilization had become life-denying. But Nietzsche didn't just reject Christian interpretations of suffering, he rejected Buddhist interpretations too. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from craving. The solution is to extinguish desire. Nietzsche found this horrifying. Buddhism was even more life-denying than Christianity. Nietzsche's alternative was radical. Embrace suffering. Don't try to eliminate it. Recognize that suffering is what gives life depth, meaning, intensity. Without suffering, there's no growth. He wrote, "The discipline of suffering, of great suffering, has created every elevation of mankind so far. Every significant human achievement emerged from suffering. Beethoven's greatest works came after he went deaf. Their suffering wasn't incidental to their greatness. It was the cause of it. Why? Because suffering forces depth. When life is comfortable, you can remain shallow." Nietzsche also believed suffering reveals character. Some people break under pressure. Others use suffering as raw material for self-transformation. This brings us to active and reactive forces. Christianity was fundamentally reactive, but some individuals respond actively. They don't resent what hurt them. They use it. Nietzsche himself embodied this principle. His entire adult life was dominated by illness. Instead, Nietzsche wrote philosophy that would influence generations. In Ecce Homo, written in 1888, Nietzsche said that in the midst of tortures, he possessed a clarity for which under healthier circumstances he wasn't refined enough. Pain sharpened his thinking. This is connected to amor fati, Loving your fate means affirming your life, including its suffering. If you remove any element, even the painful ones, you wouldn't be you anymore. Most people can't. They regret, they resent. The master looks at their suffering and says, "Yes, it was terrible, and I'm glad it happened." In 1886, Nietzsche wrote that women were not yet capable of friendship and compared them to cats and cows. A year later, he declared that when a woman has scholarly inclinations, there is usually something wrong with her sexually. These weren't offhand remarks. They appeared in published works. And they raise a question: was he describing the women of his time or revealing something darker about his own philosophy? The woman question is only the beginning. Nietzsche wrote about the blonde beast prowling for prey, praised Napoleon's campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands, dismissed democracy as mob rule. His sister literally gave copies of his books to Hitler. The Nazis built monuments to him. And while scholars explain that Nietzsche wasn't a proto-fascist, the uncomfortable truth remains. There's something in Nietzsche that totalitarians found useful. His relationships with actual women were disasters. His proposal to Lou Salome ended in humiliation. He never married, spent most of his adult life alone, and his writings reflect this failure. He describes women as fundamentally deceptive. Some defenders argue Nietzsche was critiquing 19th century gender roles, but then you encounter passages attacking women's liberation. He genuinely believed that women becoming educated would make Europe uglier. The uncomfortable reality is that Nietzsche's philosophy of hierarchy extends to gender. He believed men and women were fundamentally different types of beings. This connects to a deeper problem, his concept of natural hierarchy. He rejected the idea that all humans are equal. Some people are simply better. A Beethoven matters more than 1,000 ordinary people. But once you accept this principle, where do you stop? Nietzsche's answer was brutally consistent. Yes, some lives matter less. He writes, "The weak and the failures shall perish, first principle of our love of man." He means this ironically. The weak should perish. This is where Nietzsche starts sounding like a eugenicist. The blonde beast passage makes this worse. Nietzsche writes about the magnificent blonde beast prowling for spoil. He's describing ancient warrior aristocracies who conquered through violence and felt no guilt, and he clearly admires them. Nietzsche scholars explain that blonde here doesn't mean racially Aryan. He despised German nationalism, but here's the problem. Even if Nietzsche personally rejected racial theories, his philosophy was easily adapted to racist purposes. Consider his attitude toward war. Nietzsche lived through the Franco-Prussian War, yet he continued to write about war in terms that sound almost celebratory. He praised military values. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "You say it is the good cause that hallows even war. I say unto you, it is the good war that hallows any cause." When he praises war, he's not primarily talking about literal conflict. He's talking about agon, contest, competitive struggle. Ancient Greek culture was agonistic. This competition produced greatness. Modern culture was becoming soft, afraid to declare winners and losers. This is one of Nietzsche's more prescient critiques. Contemporary culture does struggle with merit. But here's where critics have a point. His solution is worse than the problem. He wants to restore hierarchy, allow the strong to dominate. But every historical attempt has been catastrophic. The eternal recurrence concept reveals another troubling dimension. If you had to live your life infinitely repeated, would you affirm it? But consider what this means for victims. If you were enslaved, Nietzsche's philosophy demands you affirm that suffering. This is why some critics call Nietzsche's philosophy fundamentally cruel. Consider his attitude toward pity. Christianity elevated pity into a virtue. Nietzsche saw this as catastrophic. When you pity someone, you take on their pain without helping them. But Nietzsche goes further, suggesting we shouldn't help the suffering at all. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes genuinely dangerous. It provides intellectual cover for cruelty. And yet, millions have found Nietzsche liberating. How can the same philosophy be both cruel and inspiring? If you apply them to yourself, they can be transformative. But if you apply them to others, they become justification for callousness. This is the central problem with Nietzsche. He diagnosed real cultural problems, but his solutions opened doors to horrors he never intended. He gave intellectual weapons to people who used them for purposes he would have despised, and we can't simply blame the misinterpreters. There's something in Nietzsche himself that made these distortions possible. In 1865, 20-year-old Nietzsche walked into a Leipzig bookstore and claimed he randomly discovered Schopenhauer's book, a chance encounter that would change his life. But here's what biographers discovered decades later. Nietzsche had been hearing about Schopenhauer for months, had deliberately sought out the book, and constructed the story of random discovery to make it seem like fate. This small deception reveals something crucial. Nietzsche carefully crafted his intellectual origin story, hiding influences he didn't want to acknowledge. The question is, what else was he hiding? And how much of his philosophy was shaped by things he couldn't acknowledge, diseases he contracted, traumas he suppressed, ideas he borrowed without credit? Start with the syphilis question, which has haunted Nietzsche scholarship since his death. The standard story is that Nietzsche's final collapse resulted from tertiary syphilis. The disease lay dormant for years, slowly destroying his brain. This diagnosis explained everything. But recent scholarship has challenged this. Some neurologists argue Nietzsche's symptoms don't quite match syphilis. We'll probably never know for certain. Yet the syphilis theory matters philosophically because it suggests Nietzsche's entire mature philosophy might have been produced by a diseased brain. His celebration of suffering, his attacks on pity, were these insights or symptoms of neurological damage? The distinction matters because if Nietzsche was already sick, we can't simply accept his philosophy as clear thinking. Consider how much of Nietzsche's work was written while he was barely functional. The 1880s were his sickest years. He'd work in brief bursts when the pain subsided, and somehow from this state he produced his greatest works. How much was philosophy, and how much was trauma speaking? There's another hidden influence Nietzsche never adequately acknowledged. Wagner. Yes, he wrote extensively about Wagner, but he never admitted how much Wagner shaped his entire philosophical project. When young Nietzsche met Wagner in 1868, he was a promising but conventional philologist. Wagner transformed him, but the relationship was psychologically complex. Wagner was exactly the age Nietzsche's father would have been if he'd lived. The breakup wasn't just intellectual, it was the rupture of a father-son relationship. Here's what's hidden. Nietzsche's entire mature philosophy can be read as working through his relationship with Wagner. His attack on Christianity was also an attack on Wagner's final opera. His critique of slave morality was partly critique of Wagner's nationalism. Wagner became the negative example. But he couldn't admit this, because admitting it would mean acknowledging how much he still needed Wagner's approval. The Lou Salome affair reveals similar patterns. In 1882, Nietzsche met Lou Salome, a brilliant 21-year-old Russian woman. The whole arrangement collapsed within months, leaving Nietzsche emotionally shattered. What he never admitted, Lou rejected him not just intellectually, but personally. Nietzsche claimed he wanted only philosophical companionship, but his private notebooks reveal sexual desire, romantic longing. But here's the hidden influence. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was written in the immediate aftermath. The book is about a prophet who descends from his mountain, fails to find receptive students, and returns to solitude. This is Nietzsche processing his rejection. Then there's the Schopenhauer influence, which goes deeper than Nietzsche ever acknowledged. He claimed to have moved beyond Schopenhauer, but look closely and Schopenhauer is everywhere. The will to power is essentially Schopenhauer's will renamed. This isn't overcoming Schopenhauer, it's accepting his diagnosis while rejecting his prescription. There's also the Eastern influence Nietzsche barely acknowledged. He presented himself as a uniquely European philosopher, but he read extensively about Buddhism, Hinduism, and Zoroastrianism. His concept of eternal recurrence mirrors Hindu and Buddhist ideas. His Zarathustra is explicitly named after the founder of Zoroastrianism. Yet Nietzsche insisted he was fundamentally opposed to Eastern philosophy. Why? Possibly because acknowledging the Eastern influence would undermine his claim to originality. The final hidden influence is the simplest: loneliness. Nietzsche spent most of his adult life essentially alone. He travelled constantly, lived in rented rooms, took meals alone, worked in isolation. His philosophy celebrates solitude as necessary for greatness, but there's desperation underneath. Zarathustra ends with the prophet returning to his cave, leaving humanity behind. This is presented as triumphant. But read it as someone who failed to connect with others, who ended up alone not by choice, but by inability to maintain relationships. Suddenly, it looks less like triumph and more like tragedy. In 1900, 15 months after Nietzsche died, Sigmund Freud wrote that he had denied himself the pleasure of reading Nietzsche because he feared finding insights he believed were his own original discoveries. Freud later admitted that Nietzsche had achieved greater self-knowledge than any human being who had ever lived. But here's the disturbing implication. If Nietzsche understood the human mind better than anyone, and if he spent his final decade descending into madness, what does that tell us about the relationship between psychological insight and mental stability? Carl Jung went even further. He read Thus Spoke Zarathustra as a psychological document, not a philosophical one. Zarathustra's journey Jung interpreted as Nietzsche's unconscious mind describing its own fragmentation. The various characters weren't philosophical archetypes, but pieces of Nietzsche's own psyche that he'd split off and couldn't reintegrate. According to Jung, Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch represented an inflation of the ego, an identification with archetypal energies that no individual psyche can contain. When you identify with an archetype, when you start believing you're not just a person but a destiny, a prophet, you lose contact with your human limitations. The ego swells beyond its capacity and eventually shatters. This is what Jung thought happened to Nietzsche. The evidence is in Nietzsche's final letters, written in early January 1889. He signed them as the crucified Dionysus and Nietzsche Caesar. He wrote to Cosima Wagner, Ariadne, I love you, Dionysus. He wrote, I would much rather be a Basel professor than God, but I did not dare to carry my private egoism so far as to omit the creation of the world on its account. These aren't the words of someone playing philosophical games. These are the words of someone whose sense of self has dissolved. But here's the psychological puzzle. Were these final delusions discontinuous with Nietzsche's earlier work, or were they the logical endpoint? All through the 1880s, Nietzsche had been pushing toward a philosophy of self-overcoming, of transcending human limitations. In Ecce Homo, written just before the collapse, he was already calling himself a destiny. The Madness letters sound like Ecce Homo taken one step further. This raises the disturbing possibility that Nietzsche's philosophy itself was a form of madness. If you genuinely try to overcome yourself, to transcend human limitations, you risk losing touch with reality. The boundary between prophetic vision and psychotic delusion is paper thin. Psychoanalytic interpretations go deeper. They ask, what was Nietzsche running from? One answer is trauma. Nietzsche's father died when he was 4 after seizures and mental deterioration. Nietzsche watched his father reduced to a convulsing shell. Classical psychoanalysis would note loss of the father at a crucial developmental stage, identification with the absent father, attempt to become the father through intellectual achievement, fear of suffering the same fate. And of course, he did. His final collapse mirrored his father's. From this perspective, Nietzsche's philosophy of amor fati looks like an elaborate defense mechanism against overwhelming anxiety. If you're terrified you'll go mad like your father, you have 2 choices: despair or reframe. Nietzsche chose reframe. He constructed a philosophy that made suffering not just acceptable, but necessary. Consider his concept of ressentiment. Ressentiment is the festering resentment of the weak toward the strong. But several critics have turned this around. What if Nietzsche's concept is itself driven by ressentiment? He was sickly, failed at relationships, never achieved recognition during his productive years, watched his books sell poorly. From this position of failure, Nietzsche constructed a philosophy that said, the successful people aren't actually superior, they're herd animals. Real greatness requires isolation, suffering, rejection. This is classic ressentiment. Unable to achieve what you desire, you declare that what you desire is actually inferior. The same applies to the Übermensch. On one level, it's a genuine philosophical ideal, but psychologically, it's also clearly a compensation fantasy. Nietzsche couldn't be what society valued, so he invented a new standard where the things he lacked became irrelevant. This is textbook narcissistic defense. And yet, paradoxically, this narcissistic defense might have been necessary for Nietzsche to produce his work. His psychological problems drove his philosophical innovations. The narcissistic defense was also the source of genuine insight. The question each reader must answer, was Nietzsche a genius driven mad by pursuing truth too honestly? Or was he a sick man who constructed philosophy to rationalize his sickness? Was his psychology the source of his insight, or the distortion that makes his insight unreliable? This is the paradox of Nietzsche. The sicker he got, the more profound his philosophy became, right up until the moment his mind shattered completely. And we're left wondering whether that final shattering was the inevitable result of pushing too far. In 2017, white supremacists marching in Charlottesville cited Nietzsche. That same year, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs quoted his words in TED Talks. Jordan Peterson lectured to millions about Nietzsche's insights. Leftist philosophers published books reclaiming him as a critic of capitalism. Somehow, the same dead German philosopher was simultaneously inspiring fascists, tech billionaires, conservative psychologists, and radical leftists. This isn't just misinterpretation. This is Nietzsche's philosophy functioning as a Rorschach test. The alt-right wasn't reading fabricated texts. They were reading actual Nietzsche, the attacks on equality, the celebration of hierarchy, the contempt for the weak. They found passages that seemed to validate their worldview. They weren't entirely wrong. It's there. Silicon Valley presents a completely different appropriation. Tech entrepreneurs love Nietzsche because they see themselves in his description of exceptional individuals who break rules. They read his words as validation of brutal work schedules. Move fast and break things sounds Nietzschean. But this reading misses almost everything important. He wasn't celebrating technological innovation. He was talking about spiritual transformation. Moreover, Nietzsche despised commercial culture. He would have seen tech billionaires as perfect examples of the last man, people who've invented happiness, who eliminate suffering, and in doing so eliminate the conditions for genuine greatness. But Silicon Valley's misreading reveals something. Nietzsche's language is seductive. You can read his attack on slave morality as permission to ignore critics, its philosophy as self-help for people who are already winning. Then there's Jordan Peterson, who reads Nietzsche as fundamentally concerned with meaning and responsibility. Peterson emphasizes Nietzsche's critique of nihilism while downplaying his critique of traditional morality. He makes Nietzsche sound almost conservative, but Peterson's interpretation domesticates Nietzsche. The real Nietzsche wasn't trying to preserve order. He was trying to destroy the existing order. Peterson's Nietzsche is Nietzsche with the danger removed. Meanwhile, leftist philosophers have tried to reclaim Nietzsche. They emphasize his critique of power, his unmasking of moral claims as expressions of interest. But there's a problem. He wasn't using these insights to support egalitarian movements. He was using them to attack egalitarianism. When he showed that Christian morality expressed slave resentment, he wasn't siding with the slaves. He was siding with the masters. What's striking is how confident each group is that they've understood the real Nietzsche, while everyone else has distorted him. Everyone quotes passages that support their reading. This suggests something important. Nietzsche's work is genuinely ambiguous, genuinely supports multiple readings, genuinely contains contradictions. He wrote in aphorisms, provocative statements he didn't fully explain. He used irony and hyperbole. He deliberately avoided systematic philosophy. This style was intentional. Nietzsche wanted readers to struggle with his texts. He didn't want disciples. He wanted to create philosophers. So in a sense, all these competing interpretations might be what he intended. The problem is that some interpretations lead to genuinely harmful politics, and Nietzsche's style makes it nearly impossible to definitively rule out the harmful ones. The most honest assessment is probably that Nietzsche is both valuable and dangerous, insightful and limited. His psychological insights remain profound. His critique of self-deception, his recognition that philosophy is always personal, these are permanent contributions. But his solutions are mostly unusable. The Übermensch is an impossible ideal. His celebration of hierarchy conflicts with human equality. So we're left with Nietzsche as a permanent provocation, someone who forces uncomfortable questions without offering workable answers. Every generation rediscovers him, finds different questions relevant, and every generation struggles with the same problem: how to use what's valuable in Nietzsche without enabling what's dangerous. In 1961, physicist Werner Heisenberg wrote that quantum mechanics had vindicated Nietzsche's claim that there is no objective reality, only perspectives. He wasn't the only scientist to notice this connection. Throughout the 20th century, multiple scientists independently concluded that Nietzsche had somehow anticipated their discoveries a century early, as if his philosophical speculation had accidentally described the actual structure of reality. But how could a 19th century philosopher who knew nothing about quantum mechanics somehow describe insights that would require advanced physics to discover? The rational explanation is that these scientists were reading their own discoveries back into Nietzsche's texts. But the alternative explanation is more disturbing. What if Nietzsche's perspectivism wasn't just a philosophical position, but somehow accurate? Consider Nietzsche's doctrine of perspectivism. He argued that there are no facts, only interpretations, that every observation is made from a particular perspective that shapes what can be seen. This wasn't just skepticism. Nietzsche was making a metaphysical claim. Perspectives go all the way down. Now compare this to quantum mechanics, specifically the observer effect. Quantum systems don't have definite properties until they're measured. Before observation, particles exist in superposition. Only when an observer makes a measurement does the system collapse. There's no underlying reality independent of observation. This is eerily close to Nietzsche's position. The connection extends to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which states that you cannot simultaneously know both the position and momentum of a particle. This isn't just about measurement limitations, it's fundamental to reality. Knowledge has built-in limits not because of human inadequacy, but because of reality's structure. But the connections go deeper. Nietzsche's concept of will to power isn't primarily about human psychology. It's a cosmological principle. Everything that exists expresses will to power, the drive to discharge force. Physical systems don't rest in equilibrium. They're constantly exchanging energy. Everything is will to power. The fundamental characteristic of reality is active force seeking to express itself. Compare this to contemporary physics' understanding of reality as fundamentally about information and energy exchange. Particles are better understood as processes rather than things. The universe isn't made of objects, it's made of interactions. Being is becoming. This is Nietzsche's ontology. Then there's eternal recurrence. The idea is that if time is infinite and matter is finite, every possible configuration of matter must eventually recur. Modern cosmology takes this seriously. Some versions suggest the universe might be cyclical, expanding from a big bang, eventually contracting, then banging again. Other theories involve eternal inflation, creating infinite universes. Nietzsche couldn't have known about Big Bang cosmology. Yet his eternal recurrence idea describes scenarios that modern physics debates seriously. Consider how Nietzsche's perspectivism applies to artificial intelligence. If intelligence is fundamentally about processing information from a particular perspective, then AI isn't just simulating intelligence, but genuinely exhibiting it. Different AI systems develop different perspectives. This is Nietzschean perspectivism applied to machine intelligence, and if AI continues developing, eventually achieving general intelligence, would Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch apply? An AI that could rewrite its own code, transcend its original programming, create new values, that would be self-overcoming in Nietzsche's sense. Maybe the Übermensch isn't a future human, but a future AI. Now consider how Nietzsche's critique of truth applies to postmodern information ecosystems, social media, and the crisis of epistemic authority. Nietzsche argued there are no facts, only interpretations. This seemed radical in his time. Now it describes everyday experience. In a world of algorithmic feeds where everyone sees personalized reality, we're living in Nietzschean perspectivism, whether we like it or not. Nietzsche anticipated this, but didn't provide solutions. Maybe we're in transition, what Nietzsche called the nihilistic phase, where old values have collapsed, but new ones haven't emerged. Maybe our epistemic crisis is exactly what he foresaw, the death of shared truth. There's also fascinating overlap between Nietzsche's eternal recurrence and simulation theory. If reality is computational, if some advanced civilization is running simulations of history, then eternal recurrence becomes literally true. Your life gets simulated over and over. Nietzsche's thought experiment accidentally describes a hypothesis that physicists and philosophers now debate seriously. Finally, consider Nietzsche's master-slave morality in the context of future enhancement technologies. If we develop genetic engineering, neural implants, life extension, we'll face questions Nietzsche's philosophy addresses directly. Should everyone get enhanced? If enhancement creates genuine superiority, does that justify hierarchy? Some transhumanists embrace exactly this vision, citing Nietzsche explicitly. They want to overcome biological limitations, become post-human. This is the Übermensch as technological project. Others are horrified, seeing it as engineering inequality. Both responses make sense from different Nietzschean perspectives. These speculative connections reveal something important. Nietzsche's philosophy remains productively strange. It continues generating new questions as technology and science develop. His perspectivism maps onto quantum mechanics. His will to power describes complex systems. His eternal recurrence connects to cosmology. None of this proves Nietzsche was right, but it shows his philosophy engaged with fundamental questions that keep recurring. What is reality? What is truth? What should humans become? Whether his answers were right is less important than that he asked properly. He showed what radical questioning looks like. That's his permanent value, not his specific claims, but his method, his courage, his willingness to think dangerously. In his final notebooks before the collapse, Nietzsche scribbled a sentence he never published. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. In passages his sister deemed too disturbing to include, Nietzsche explored whether eternal recurrence might be physically real, whether the universe operates on a closed loop of matter rearranging itself infinitely, and whether this means you've already lived your life an infinite number of times and will make them again forever, with no escape, no variation, no hope of breaking the cycle. This is Nietzsche at his most terrifying, the philosopher who looked into the abyss and reported back what he saw, but most readers sanitize him. They turn eternal recurrence into a psychological thought experiment. They make it safe. But what if Nietzsche meant it literally? What if the universe really is cyclical and consciousness is trapped in an infinite loop? Start with the cosmological argument. Nietzsche reasoned, time is infinite, matter is finite. If you have infinite time but only finite possible configurations, then every configuration must recur. This moment, this thought, you've experienced it infinite times before and will experience it infinite times again. Nothing changes. Modern physics hasn't disproven this. Some cosmological models involve cyclical universes. If this cycle is eternal, then Nietzsche's logic holds. Your exact life would recur. Maybe not the next cycle, but eventually, given infinite time, the atoms would arrange themselves exactly as they are now. But here's what makes this truly dark. If eternal recurrence is real, you have no free will. Every choice you make, you've made infinite times before. The feeling of choice is illusion. You're a recording playing on infinite loop. And here's the truly horrifying implication. If you're suffering now, you've experienced that suffering infinite times already and will experience it infinite times more. There's no escape, no redemption, just eternal repetition of every moment, including the worst ones. All suffering that exists has existed forever and will exist forever. This is why amor fati takes on such dark significance. If eternal recurrence is real, the only psychologically bearable response is to affirm it completely. You must love your suffering because it's eternal. The alternative is eternal despair. Amor fati isn't inspirational advice, it's existential necessity. Love it or go mad. But Nietzsche went darker still. In unpublished notes, he explored whether consciousness itself might be eternal. Your body dies, atoms scatter. But given infinite time, those atoms will eventually recombine. Your consciousness will emerge again, experience life again, die again, over and over. You're not really mortal, you're trapped in eternal rebirth. Buddhism teaches something similar, but frames it as suffering we can escape. But Nietzsche rejected this escape route. There is no nirvana, there is no exit from existence. Consciousness is matter configured in a certain way, and that configuration will recur. You cannot escape being. Some interpreters have suggested Nietzsche's madness was his attempt to escape eternal recurrence. If you're trapped in an infinite loop, perhaps madness is the only variation possible. Perhaps his final breakdown was unconscious attempt to break the pattern by shattering the self. Except you don't escape, because the loop will recur and consciousness will emerge again. Or maybe the madness was recognition. The moment Nietzsche fully understood, eternal recurrence wasn't metaphor, but reality. The moment he saw infinite past lives stretching backward and infinite future lives stretching forward, that recognition might shatter any mind. How do you stay sane when you realize you're trapped in existence forever? There's another dark reading that Nietzsche's philosophy is fundamentally anti-natalist. If eternal recurrence is real, if consciousness is trapped in infinite loop, then every birth is infinite crime. You're not giving someone one life, you're condemning them to infinite lives, infinite suffering. Nietzsche never stated this explicitly, but his logic points elsewhere. If you accept eternal recurrence, how can you justify reproduction? The most merciful act would be extinction. But here's the trap. Even if humanity goes extinct, consciousness will emerge again. Given infinite time and finite matter, life will recur eventually. You can't end consciousness by ending humanity. This is Nietzsche's cosmological nihilism, the idea that nothing matters because everything recurs. Civilizations rise and fall forever. The same wars, the same suffering, repeating without end. Nothing you do matters because it's already been done and will be done again. And yet Nietzsche claimed this should be affirmed. Why? Perhaps because the alternative is worse. If you reject eternal recurrence, if you hate your life, you must hate it forever. But if you affirm it, you transform prison into home. You're still trapped, but you're trapped in something you love. This might be Nietzsche's ultimate teaching, that meaning isn't found in transcendence, but in affirmation. It's not inspirational, it's choosing the lesser horror. There's also the dark interpretation of the Übermensch as impossible ideal that destroys everyone who attempts it. What if every genuine attempt to transcend human limitations shatters the person attempting it? Nietzsche tried and went mad. What if the Übermensch can't exist because the self can't survive the transformation? You can't overcome yourself without destroying yourself. Then the Übermensch is not higher humanity, but extinction of humanity. This might explain why no one has achieved the Übermensch. Not because people lack courage, but because the goal is incoherent. Nietzsche's philosophy is elaborate instruction manual for self-destruction disguised as path to transcendence. And if Nietzsche, the strongest philosophical mind of his generation, couldn't bear what he discovered, what hope do the rest of us have? We can pretend his philosophy is inspirational, but underneath remains the original vision, consciousness trapped in eternal recurrence, will to power grinding on meaninglessly forever. And if that's the truth, then perhaps madness was the sanest response. On January 3rd, 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche wrapped his arms around a horse being beaten in a Turin street and collapsed into 11 years of silence. During those 11 years, he spoke occasionally, played piano, recognized certain visitors, but never wrote another word of philosophy, never explained what happened. His mother cared for him until she died in 1897. Then his sister Elizabeth took over, reshaping his legacy while he sat vacant, sometimes smiling, sometimes agitated, but always somewhere else. But here's what haunts every Nietzsche scholar. What if the madness wasn't an ending but a transformation? What if Nietzsche didn't break down but broke through? What if those 11 years of silence contained truths he'd been seeking his entire life, but which can't be communicated in language? The standard medical explanation is tertiary syphilis destroying his brain. Clean, simple, tragic. But the timing is suspicious. Nietzsche had been ill his entire adult life, yet remained intellectually productive. Then suddenly, at the height of his creative powers, he collapses completely, instantly. From brilliant philosopher to incoherent madman in a single moment. The horse incident is our only clue. Nietzsche supposedly saw a horse being whipped, ran to the horse, threw his arms around its neck, and collapsed, weeping. Then he spent the next few days writing bizarre letters before descending into permanent incoherence. But consider what Nietzsche had been writing about. In Ecce Homo he wrote, "I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth." He wasn't predicting his philosophical influence centuries later. He was describing something immediate. The horse incident might have been the trigger, the moment external reality and internal vision collided so violently that his psyche couldn't maintain coherence. He'd spent decades thinking about suffering, about cruelty, and then he saw suffering incarnate. He didn't just observe suffering, he became it. The boundary between himself and the horse dissolved. And in that dissolution, perhaps, his ego structure shattered permanently. But was this breakdown or breakthrough? Mystics from every tradition describe ego death as goal of spiritual practice. You dissolve the boundaries between self and world, experience unity with existence. It's described as enlightenment, but it's also described as terrifying. And people who experience it often can't function normally afterward. What if Nietzsche achieved enlightenment? What if he actually succeeded? He overcome the self completely, and having no self left, he couldn't write philosophy anymore. He just existed, beyond language, beyond thought. This would explain why he sometimes seemed happy during his madness years. Visitors reported him smiling, humming, content. If he'd achieved ego death, if he'd dissolved into pure being, then suffering would no longer touch him. But it would also explain why he couldn't communicate it. Enlightenment experiences are notoriously ineffable. Nietzsche spent his career trying to express insights that exceeded language's capacity. Maybe he finally had an insight so profound that it destroyed his ability to use language at all. Consider his final letters. He signed them as Dionysus and as the Crucified, as if he'd become both simultaneously. He wrote to Cosima Wagner, Ariadne, I love you. The ambiguity might be the point. In ego dissolution, you're not this or that. You're everything and nothing. Nietzsche had written about Dionysian intoxication, about becoming one with the primal unity. Maybe he finally achieved it. His letter to Franz Overbeck is even stranger. I would rather be a Basel professor than God, but I did not dare to carry my private egoism so far as to omit the creation of the world on its account. He's claiming to be God, to have created the world. Madness, clearly. Except in certain states of consciousness, you do experience yourself as creating the world, as the universe becoming aware of itself. If Nietzsche experienced this, if he had moment of recognizing himself as the ground of all being, it would explain the grandiosity. There's another possibility, darker, that Nietzsche saw something he wasn't supposed to see. He'd spent decades dismantling every comforting illusion. And when he'd destroyed every protection, what he saw shattered him. His notebooks from 1888 contain passages too disturbing for his finished works. If he had moment of seeing through the illusion completely, that moment might have destroyed the very structure that makes coherent experience possible. Or perhaps he saw eternal recurrence not as abstract concept, but as direct perception. Imagine suddenly remembering infinite past lives, infinite repetitions of this exact moment. That might be what broke him. The mind can handle the idea of eternal recurrence. It can't handle the experience of it. Then there's the disturbing possibility that Nietzsche chose madness, that it was voluntary exit from a reality he could no longer bear. He'd written that some truths are so terrible they drive people mad. What if he deliberately pushed himself over the edge, finally surrendering to the dissolution he'd been philosophically approaching for years? This would make his madness the ultimate expression of his philosophy, complete self-overcoming. But we'll never know, because Nietzsche left no explanation. The person who could have told us what happened disappeared in that moment on the Turin street. What remained was a body that breathed, ate, occasionally spoke, but never again produced coherent thought. What was he experiencing during those 11 years? We can't know. He couldn't tell us. But sometimes visitors reported him playing piano. Sometimes he'd suddenly speak a complete sentence, then return to silence. Sometimes he'd weep. Sometimes he'd smile as if hearing a joke no one else could hear. He was somewhere, experiencing something. But where? What? The most haunting possibility is that he was trying to tell us something but couldn't make the words work anymore. That those 11 years were him attempting to communicate an insight so profound it broke language. But we can't understand. The gap between his experience and our understanding was too vast. He crossed a threshold, and the door closed behind him. Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900, 11.5 years after the horse incident. His final words, according to his sister, were Mutter, ich bin dumm. Mother, I am stupid. Whether he actually said this, whether it meant anything, all unknown. The man who spent his life pursuing truth beyond illusion left us with one final illusion, his own silence, which we can interpret however we choose, but never truly understand. And perhaps that's fitting. Nietzsche always said truth was perspectival, that there are no facts, only interpretations. His own final chapter is exactly that. He became the perfect Nietzschean text, ambiguous, contradictory, inviting endless readings, yielding no final meaning. He disappeared into his own philosophy and left us wondering whether what we call his madness was tragedy or triumph, ending or transformation, breakdown or the breakthrough he'd been seeking all along. The mystery remains. And in remaining, it asks the question his entire philosophy asked: what are you willing to sacrifice to know the truth? What would you give to see reality without illusion? Would you risk your sanity? Nietzsche answered yes and paid the price. Whether he found what he sought, whether the price was worth it, we cannot say. We can only look at those 11 years of silence and wonder what secrets they contain. And perhaps the wondering is enough. Perhaps the mystery itself is the teaching, that some questions have no answers, some truths can't be spoken, some journeys lead beyond language itself. Nietzsche went there. He left us maps, warnings, invitations, but he couldn't tell us what he found. And maybe that's because there are no words for it. Maybe there never were. In 1882, Nietzsche wrote in his notebook, "I am afraid we are not getting rid of God because we still believe in grammar." It's one of his strangest statements, and most readers skip past it without understanding what he means. But this sentence contains one of Nietzsche's deepest insights, that the structure of language itself traps us in certain ways of thinking, that the grammar we use forces us to see the world in terms of subjects and objects, causes and effects, things that act and things that are acted upon. And as long as we think in these terms, as long as we're imprisoned by the structure of our sentences, we can't escape metaphysical assumptions that no longer make sense. We keep God alive every time we say, "I think," because that sentence structure assumes a self that does the thinking, a subject behind the action, exactly the kind of metaphysical entity that dies with God. This is why Nietzsche became increasingly frustrated with traditional philosophy. Philosophy uses language to pursue truth, but what if language itself makes certain truths impossible to express? What if the medium of philosophy, rational argument in grammatical sentences, forces you into assumptions you're trying to escape? You can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. You can't use subject-predicate grammar to escape the metaphysics of subjects and predicates. Consider how we talk about thinking. We say, "I think," or "a thought occurs to me," or "I had an idea." Every one of these formulations assumes a self that's separate from its thoughts, a thinker who has ideas the way you might have possessions. But what if this is backward? What if thinking isn't something you do, but something that happens, and the you is just a convenient fiction we create after the fact to organize the chaos of mental processes? Nietzsche increasingly believed this was true, but he couldn't express it clearly because language forces him to write, "I believe," which immediately reinstates the very self he's trying to question. This is one reason Nietzsche's writing became increasingly fragmented, increasingly aphoristic. The traditional philosophical essay, with its linear arguments and logical progression, assumes that truth can be reached through rational discourse. But what if the truths Nietzsche was pursuing couldn't be reached that way? What if they required a different mode of expression entirely? In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche abandons philosophical argument almost entirely. Instead, he writes something like poetry, like scripture, like mythology. Zarathustra speaks in parables and metaphors. He doesn't argue for eternal recurrence. He presents it as a vision, a demon's whisper, something that has to be experienced rather than proven. He doesn't define the Übermensch. He evokes it through images, through stories, through the character of Zarathustra himself. Why this shift? Because Nietzsche realized that his deepest insights couldn't be communicated through traditional philosophical prose. You can't argue someone into understanding eternal recurrence. You can't prove that they should affirm life despite its suffering. These aren't positions you reach through logic. They're existential stances, ways of being in the world, and they have to be shown rather than told, evoked rather than demonstrated. This is why Nietzsche was so concerned with misunderstanding. He knew his work would be misread, misinterpreted, twisted to serve purposes he never intended. And the problem wasn't just that people were stupid or malicious. The problem was structural, built into the nature of communication itself. To write at all, he had to use language. But language is inherently public, conventional, designed for ordinary communication about ordinary things. How do you use this medium to express something radically new, something that challenges the very categories the language assumes? Nietzsche wrote that every word is a prejudice, a prejudgment that forces experience into predetermined categories. When you name something, you stop seeing it freshly. You see only what the word allows you to see. This is why poets constantly struggle against language, trying to make words do things they weren't designed to do, trying to express experiences that exceed conventional categories. And this is why philosophy, which uses language most conventionally, most carefully, most logically, might be the least capable of genuine innovation. Consider the word God. It's packed with associations, with centuries of theological debate, with emotional resonances. When Nietzsche writes God is dead, he knows that every reader brings their own understanding of what God means. For some, it means the Christian deity. For others, it means any transcendent ground of value. For still others, it means tradition, authority, meaning itself. Nietzsche can't control how the phrase is understood. Language escapes the author's intention the moment it's written. This is why Nietzsche was simultaneously obsessed with being understood and convinced that he wouldn't be understood until long after his death. He wrote in Ecce Homo with characteristic grandiosity, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." But he also wrote more soberly that he was writing for readers who wouldn't exist for generations, people who had lived through the catastrophes he predicted and could finally understand what he'd been warning about. The problem of philosophical communication becomes even more acute when you're trying to communicate something that undermines the reader's entire framework. If you're arguing within a shared framework, communication is relatively straightforward. You can point to evidence, construct logical arguments, appeal to shared intuitions. But if you're trying to get someone to see that their entire framework is problematic, how do you do that? Any argument you make will be understood within their existing framework, which neutralizes the challenge. This is why Nietzsche increasingly used shock, provocation, exaggeration. He'd make outrageous claims, not because he believed them literally, but because he needed to jolt readers out of their comfortable assumptions. When he writes that women are not yet capable of friendship, he's not conducting careful sociological analysis. He's trying to provoke, to make you angry enough to think, to question assumptions you didn't know you had. But this strategy backfired spectacularly. Readers took his provocations literally. They didn't see the irony, the exaggeration, the deliberate outrageousness. They read him as making straightforward claims and then either agreed or disagreed, completely missing the point. Nietzsche wanted to transform how people think, but most readers just extracted opinions from his work and filed them under things Nietzsche believed. This led Nietzsche to a profound pessimism about communication. He wrote that understanding requires similar experiences. You can't explain colour to someone blind from birth. You can't explain music to someone who's deaf. And you can't explain Nietzsche's insights to someone who hasn't suffered deeply, questioned radically, lived through the death of God in their own life. Communication requires shared ground, but Nietzsche was trying to communicate from beyond the ground most people stand on. This is connected to his concept of exoteric and esoteric writing, which he borrowed from ancient philosophy. Exoteric writing is for the public, for ordinary readers, for people who want clear answers and simple truths. Esoteric writing is for the few, for those who have ears to hear, for those capable of understanding deeper meanings. Great philosophers, Nietzsche believed, always wrote on both levels simultaneously. The surface is accessible to everyone, but beneath the surface lies a deeper teaching, available only to those who can read between the lines. Nietzsche claimed to write this way himself. The obvious meaning of his texts, the shocking aphorisms and provocative claims, that's the exoteric level. But for careful readers, for those who can see patterns across his work, who can catch his ironies and qualifications, there's a deeper teaching. The problem is that most readers never get past the surface. They're shocked by his attack on Christianity and never understand what he's really saying about values. They're horrified by his critique of pity and never grasp his concern about psychological health. This creates a tragic situation. Nietzsche needs readers who can understand him, but understanding him requires capacities that are extremely rare. You need to be able to tolerate radical uncertainty. You need to be able to think against your own deepest assumptions. You need to be able to hold multiple contradictory ideas simultaneously without rushing to resolve them. Most people can't do this. Most people need certainty, consistency, clear answers. And for those people, Nietzsche's work is dangerous because they'll extract simple messages from complex texts and act on them with the certainty he was trying to undermine. Nietzsche also struggled with the temporal dimension of communication. He was writing in the 1880s, but he was trying to address problems that wouldn't fully manifest for decades. How do you write about the death of God when most people still believe in God? How do you warn about nihilism when the culture is still confident and optimistic? How do you describe the crisis of meaning when meaning seems secure? You're essentially speaking from the future to the present, and the present can't understand because it hasn't lived through what you're describing. This is why Nietzsche called himself untimely, why his books were titled Untimely Meditations. He was out of sync with his own time, writing for a future he could see, but others couldn't. And this created profound loneliness. Imagine seeing clearly where your civilization is headed, seeing the catastrophe approaching, trying to warn people and having them dismiss you as eccentric or mad. Imagine having insights that you know are important, but being unable to make anyone understand. This was Nietzsche's experience throughout his productive life. The loneliness of failed communication appears throughout his work. Zarathustra descends from his mountain eager to share his wisdom, but the marketplace crowd laughs at him. His disciples misunderstand him. His animals repeat his teachings, but mechanically, without comprehension. Finally, he returns to his cave, having failed to find anyone who truly understands. This is Nietzsche's own story, his own experience of trying and failing to communicate across the gulf that separated him from his contemporaries. But there's an even deeper problem lurking here. What if the things Nietzsche most wanted to communicate can't be communicated in principle? What if there are truths that can only be experienced, never expressed? What if the most important insights are precisely those that exceed language's capacity? Nietzsche increasingly believed this was true. The experience of eternal recurrence, the moment when you truly grasp that this life repeats infinitely, this can't be described. You can say the words eternal recurrence, but the words don't convey the experience. Similarly, amor fati isn't a doctrine you accept intellectually. It's a state you achieve existentially. You can't be argued into it. You have to live your way into it through suffering, through struggle, through transformation. This is why Nietzsche valued music so highly, especially in his early work. Music, he argued, communicates directly, without the mediation of concepts. When you hear a Beethoven symphony, you're not receiving propositional content that could be expressed in words. You're experiencing something that exists only in the medium of sound, something that affects you emotionally and physiologically in ways that bypass language entirely. This is closer to genuine communication than any philosophical argument because it doesn't rely on shared conceptual frameworks. It creates its own world, its own logic, its own truth. This is why Nietzsche was so drawn to Wagner initially. Wagner's music dramas seem to offer a way around the limitations of linguistic communication. They combined music, poetry, drama, staging, creating a total artwork that could communicate on multiple levels simultaneously. You didn't just understand Wagner's operas intellectually, you experienced them viscerally, and that experience could transform you in ways that arguments never could. Of course, Nietzsche later broke with Wagner, partly because he came to see Wagner's work as too Christian, too redemption-focused, too life-denying. But he never abandoned the insight that the deepest truths might require non-linguistic modes of expression. This is why his own writing became increasingly literary, increasingly dependent on metaphor and imagery, increasingly unwilling to make straightforward arguments. But even metaphor has limits. Nietzsche could write about the Übermensch, could use the image of a bridge, could talk about self-overcoming. But all of this remains words on a page. The reader can understand the metaphor intellectually without being transformed by it, and transformation, not intellectual understanding, was what Nietzsche wanted to achieve. He didn't want to add to philosophical knowledge. He wanted to change how people live. This is the ultimate frustration. The most important things can't be taught, can only be learned through experience. You can't make someone understand suffering by describing it. They have to suffer. You can't make someone grasp the death of God by arguing about it. They have to experience the vertigo of meaninglessness. You can't make someone capable of amor fati by explaining it. They have to achieve it through their own struggle. So what's a philosopher to do? If the deepest truths can't be communicated, why write at all? Nietzsche's answer seems to be that you write anyway, knowing you'll mostly fail, hoping that a few readers at the right moment in their lives will encounter your words and something will click. You're not transmitting information, you're providing resources that readers can use in their own transformation. Your words are tools, not truths, and whether they work depends not on how well you write, but on who's reading and what they're capable of receiving. This is why Nietzsche wrote, "I am not heard," but continued writing. He was planting seeds for a future he wouldn't see. He was creating a voice that would speak to readers not yet born, readers who would live through the catastrophes he predicted and desperately need different ways of thinking. He was accepting that communication across time might be more possible than communication across contemporary cultural differences, and perhaps he was right. His work was ignored or misunderstood during his life, but a century later, after the wars and totalitarianisms he predicted, after the crisis of meaning he diagnosed, readers encountered his work and found it speaking directly to their experience. The failed communication of his own time became successful communication across time. The loneliness he experienced was the price of being heard by the future. But this raises a haunting question. When Nietzsche collapsed in Turin, when he descended into 11 years of silence, was this communication failure or communication success? He spent his productive life struggling to express insights that exceeded language's capacity. And then suddenly he stopped using language altogether. Was this breakdown or breakthrough? Did language finally fail him completely? Or did he finally reach a truth so profound that it could only be expressed through silence? We'll never know. But the possibility haunts his entire project. Perhaps the deepest wisdom lies beyond words. Perhaps philosophy reaches its limit when it recognizes that some truths can't be spoken, only lived. Perhaps Nietzsche's final silence was his truest teaching, the one lesson that couldn't be expressed any other way. And if we could understand that silence, if we could hear what it's saying, we might finally grasp what Nietzsche spent his life trying to communicate and never quite succeeding. But then again, maybe that's the point. Maybe the struggle to communicate the incommunicable is all we can do. Maybe philosophy is fundamentally tragic, doomed to reach for truths it can never quite grasp, to speak insights it can never quite express. And maybe that's enough. In the opening pages of On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche writes something that most readers find puzzling. He praises forgetfulness as an active faculty, a positive force, not merely the absence of memory, but a kind of doorkeeper that actively blocks the past from overwhelming the present. He compares it to digestion, to how the stomach processes food without your conscious awareness. Without this process, without the ability to forget, Nietzsche argues, you couldn't experience anything new. You'd be paralyzed by memory, trapped in an endless replay of everything that's ever happened to you, unable to act because every action would trigger cascades of associations and recollections. Forgetfulness, he insists, is essential for happiness, for health, for sanity, and modern civilization, with its obsession with history, its demand that we remember everything, its monuments and museums and commemorations, is making us sick by destroying our capacity to forget. This is one of Nietzsche's strangest and most profound insights, that remembering too much is a disease, that historical consciousness is a burden, that the ability to forget is what separates healthy individuals and cultures from sick ones, and it goes directly against everything modern culture teaches. We're told to learn from history, to remember the past, to never forget. Entire peoples define themselves by collective memories of suffering. Individuals construct their identities from biographical narratives. We build monuments so we won't forget. We record everything so nothing is lost. And Nietzsche is saying, this is killing you. This is making you weak. You need to forget. To understand why, you have to understand Nietzsche's concept of historical sense, which he develops most fully in his essay On the Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life. Historical sense is the ability to see everything in historical context, to understand how the present emerged from the past, to recognize that all values and institutions and beliefs have histories, that nothing is eternal or necessary. This sounds valuable, and in moderation it is. Understanding history prevents dogmatism, opens you to change, helps you see that things could be different than they are. But Nietzsche argues that modern Europeans have too much historical sense. They know too much history. They're too aware of how everything is contingent, how all values are constructed, how nothing is permanent. And this knowledge paralyzes them. If you're constantly aware that your values are just historical accidents, why commit to them? If you know that everything you believe will eventually be overturned, why believe anything strongly? If you see your own culture as just one among many, all equally relative, why fight for it? This is the danger of too much history. It creates what Nietzsche calls ironic culture, where people can't take anything seriously because they're too aware of its relativity. They collect ideas like tourists collect souvenirs, sampling this philosophy, trying that value system, never committing to anything because commitment requires a certain blindness, a certain forgetting of alternatives, a certain unself-consciousness that historical awareness destroys. Nietzsche contrasts this with what he calls the unhistorical and the suprahistorical. The unhistorical is the animal's condition, living purely in the present, experiencing each moment without the weight of past or future. A cow grazes in the field, and for the cow there is only this moment, this grass, this sensation. It doesn't remember yesterday's grazing, it doesn't anticipate tomorrow's, it just is, fully present, completely absorbed. And Nietzsche suggests, provocatively, that human happiness requires something of this animal forgetfulness, this capacity to live in the present without the burden of accumulated memory. But humans can't be purely unhistorical. We're conscious beings. We remember, we anticipate, we construct narratives. So Nietzsche offers a second alternative, the suprahistorical. This is the perspective that sees all of history as essentially the same, that recognizes the eternal patterns beneath historical change, that achieves a kind of detachment from the flux of events. Art and religion, at their best, provide this suprahistorical perspective. They lift you out of the flow of time and give you access to something eternal, something that transcends historical contingency. But most modern people achieve neither the unhistorical nor the suprahistorical. They're stuck in the historical, aware of change, but unable to transcend it, remembering everything but unable to forget, knowing too much to act decisively. And this creates what Nietzsche calls the disease of history, a condition where knowledge of the past prevents action in the present. Consider how this plays out in personal life. Someone who remembers every hurt, every slight, every disappointment, can they forgive? Can they start fresh? Can they experience new relationships without the ghosts of old ones haunting them? No. They're imprisoned by memory. Every new person they meet is compared to past relationships. Every potential action is evaluated against past failures. They can't be present because the past is always with them. Or consider someone who's constantly examining their own motivations, endlessly aware of how their current beliefs emerged from childhood experiences, always suspicious of their own desires because they know those desires are historically conditioned. Can such a person act decisively? Can they commit to anything? Or are they paralyzed by self-consciousness, by knowing too much about themselves? Nietzsche argues that action requires a certain forgetfulness, a certain capacity to shut out distracting thoughts and memories and simply do. Great individuals throughout history weren't the ones who thought most carefully about whether their actions were justified. They were the ones who could forget objections, forget alternatives, forget doubts, and simply act with total commitment. This doesn't mean being stupid or thoughtless. It means having the strength to make decisions and act on them without being paralyzed by awareness of all the reasons you might be wrong. Nietzsche contrasts this with what he calls the unhistorical and the suprahistorical. The unhistorical is the animal's condition, living purely in the present, experiencing each moment without the weight of past or future. A cow grazes in the field, and for the cow there is only this moment, this grass, this sensation. It doesn't remember yesterday's grazing, it doesn't anticipate tomorrow's, it just is, fully present, completely absorbed. And Nietzsche suggests, provocatively, that human happiness requires something of this animal forgetfulness, this capacity to live in the present without the burden of accumulated memory. But humans can't be purely unhistorical. We're conscious beings, we remember, we anticipate, We construct narratives. So Nietzsche offers a second alternative, the suprahistorical. This is the perspective that sees all of history as essentially the same, that recognizes the eternal patterns beneath historical change, that achieves a kind of detachment from the flux of events. Art and religion, at their best, provide this suprahistorical perspective. They lift you out of the flow of time and give you access to something eternal, something that transcends historical contingency. But most modern people achieve neither the unhistorical nor the suprahistorical. They're stuck in the historical, aware of change but unable to transcend it, remembering everything but unable to forget, knowing too much to act decisively. And this creates what Nietzsche calls the disease of history, a condition where knowledge of the past prevents action in the present. Consider how this plays out in personal life. Someone who remembers every hurt, every slight, every disappointment, can they forgive? Can they start fresh? Can they experience new relationships without the ghosts of old ones haunting them? No, they're imprisoned by memory. Every new person they meet is compared to past relationships. Every potential action is evaluated against past failures. They can't be present because the past is always with them. Or consider someone who's constantly examining their own motivations, endlessly aware of how their current beliefs emerged from childhood experiences, always suspicious of their own desires because they know those desires are historically conditioned. Can such a person act decisively? Can they commit to anything? Or are they paralyzed by self-consciousness, by knowing too much about themselves? Nietzsche argues that action requires a certain forgetfulness, a certain capacity to shut out distracting thoughts and memories and simply do. Great individuals throughout history weren't the ones who thought most carefully about whether their actions were justified. They were the ones who could forget objections, forget alternatives, forget doubts, and simply act with total commitment. This doesn't mean being stupid or thoughtless. It means having the strength to make decisions and act on them without being paralyzed by awareness of all the reasons you might be wrong. This connects to Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment, which we've touched on before, but which has a specific temporal dimension. Ressentiment is what happens when you can't forget injuries. A strong person is hurt, responds, or doesn't, and moves on. The memory fades, the injury doesn't define them, but a weak person, someone lacking the capacity for active forgetting, nurtures the memory of injury. It festers, it grows, it becomes the organizing center of their identity. They define themselves by what was done to them, by who wronged them, by grievances they can't let go. And this creates a fundamental difference in temporal orientation. The strong person is future-oriented. They're thinking about what they're going to create, what they're going to become, what they're going to achieve. The past is resource material, lessons learned, but it doesn't dominate. The resentful person is past-oriented. They're constantly returning to old injuries, rehearsing old grievances, demanding that the past be acknowledged, that historical wrongs be righted. They want the world to recognize their suffering, to validate their pain, to make restitution. Nietzsche sees this temporal orientation playing out at every level of culture. Entire social movements are built on memories of historical injustice. Entire peoples define themselves by past suffering. And while Nietzsche isn't denying that injustices occurred, he's questioning whether organizing your identity around them is healthy. Does constant remembrance of oppression make you stronger or weaker? Does it enable action or paralyze it? Does it orient you toward creating a better future or toward demanding acknowledgement of a terrible past? His answer is clear. Too much memory of suffering makes you sick. It traps you in victim identity. It makes you dependent on others acknowledging your pain. It prevents you from moving forward because moving forward feels like betraying the past, forgetting those who suffered, abandoning the dead. Better, Nietzsche suggests, to forget. Not to deny that suffering happened, but to let it go, to refuse to be defined by it, to orient yourself toward what you're creating rather than what was done to you. This is deeply controversial, and Nietzsche knew it. He's essentially telling oppressed people to forget their oppression, to stop dwelling on historical injustice, to get over it and move on. This sounds callous. But Nietzsche would argue that continued focus on past suffering serves the powerful, not the powerless. As long as you're demanding recognition of your pain, you're still orienting yourself toward those who caused it. You're giving them power over you. True freedom comes from forgetting them entirely, from creating something new rather than endlessly processing something old.